The letter arrived on a gray morning, and Eleanor Whitmore's hands trembled the moment she saw the royal seal pressed into the wax. She did not open it right away. She stared at it on the wooden table as if it might vanish if she looked away. Her mother, Margaret, stood behind her, wiping flour from her fingers onto her apron, waiting. "Open it," Margaret said. "Standing here won't tell us what it says." Eleanor broke the seal with a knife because her hands were shaking too much to do it cleanly. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, written in a careful, formal hand. It was an invitation to the royal ball, held at the palace in 3 weeks. Her name was written at the top, spelled correctly, which surprised her more than the invitation itself. "This must be a mistake," she said, reading it twice. "It has your name on it," Margaret said. "Read it again if you must, but it will still say Eleanor Whitmore." Eleanor set the letter down and pressed her palms flat against the table, as if to steady the room around her. She was the daughter of a seamstress. Her family owned a small shop on the edge of the city, where they mended coats and stitched dresses for women who could never afford new silk. She had never set foot inside the palace gates. She had only seen them from a distance, tall and gray against the sky, guarded by men who did not look at people like her. "Someone made an error," Eleanor said again. "There must be another Eleanor Whitmore in the city." Margaret shook her head slowly. She had heard, through a cousin who worked in the palace kitchens, that a distant relative of theirs, a woman named Harriet who had married into a minor noble family years ago, had put Eleanor's name forward as a guest. It was not an error. It was a kindness, or perhaps a whim, but it was real. "You are going," Margaret said. "I don't have anything to wear to a royal ball," Eleanor said. "Everyone there will be dressed in silk and jewels. I would embarrass myself. I would embarrass you." "You have hands that can sew anything," Margaret said. "You have made dresses for half the women in this city. Make yourself something simple, something honest. You do not need silk to walk into a room." Eleanor did not answer at first. She looked at the invitation again, at the elegant handwriting, at the royal seal that meant nothing to her beyond fear and curiosity. Part of her wanted to refuse it outright, to fold it away and forget it had ever come. But another part of her, quieter and harder to ignore, wanted to see the palace just once. She wanted to walk through those tall doors and see what a life so different from her own actually looked like, even if only for one night. Eleanor thought of her father, who had passed 3 winters ago, and how he used to say that pride was not about standing above others, but about standing honestly as yourself, wherever you happened to be. He had been a quiet man, a carpenter who worked with his hands the same way she now worked with fabric and thread, and he had never once wished for a life grander than the one he had. She wondered what he would say if he knew his daughter had been invited to the palace. She suspected he would tell her to go, and to go exactly as she was. "I will go," she said finally, "but I will wear what I choose. I will not pretend to be something I am not." Margaret smiled for the first time since the letter had arrived. "That," she said, "is exactly why you should go." Over the following days, Eleanor worked on her dress in the evenings, after the shop had closed and the last customer had left. She chose a deep blue fabric, plain but well made, without lace or embroidery. She cut it simply, with clean lines that flattered her without drawing attention to itself. She did not add jewels or ribbons. She wanted the dress to be exactly what it was, nothing more. Her younger brother, Oliver, watched her work one night, sitting on a stool near the window. "Won't people laugh at you?" he asked, "for wearing something so plain among all those fine ladies?" "Perhaps," Eleanor said, not looking up from her stitching, "but I would rather be laughed at for being myself than admired for pretending to be someone I am not." Oliver considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if the idea made more sense to him than he expected. He did not ask again. While Eleanor stitched her dress by candlelight, far across the city, inside the palace walls, Duke Aldrich Rothmore stood in his private study, holding a small painted portrait in his hands. It was not a formal commission. It had been painted months earlier, at a market fair by a traveling artist his aunt, Lady Constance, had hired without explanation. The portrait showed a young woman with dark hair and a steady, unguarded expression, caught mid-laugh at something outside the frame. Aldrich did not know her name. He had asked his aunt many times, and each time she had smiled and said only that the right moment would reveal itself. "You cannot simply hand a man a painting of a stranger and expect him to fall in love with it," Aldrich had told her once, half amused, half irritated. "I am not asking you to fall in love with a painting," Lady Constance had replied. "I am asking you to remember a face. The rest will happen, or it will not. That is not my concern." Aldrich was not a man given to romantic notions. He had spent years managing his family's estate, attending council meetings, and fielding proposals from noble families eager to secure a marriage that would benefit their own standing. He had grown tired of women who spoke to him as though he were a title rather than a person, who laughed at jokes he had not made and agreed with opinions he had not stated. The portrait, strange as it was, had stayed with him in a way none of those women had. He set the painting down on his desk and looked out the window toward the city below, where lights flickered in windows he would never see up close. Somewhere out there was the woman in the portrait, living a life he knew nothing about. He had told his aunt, more than once, that he had no interest in chasing a face he had never actually met. And yet he had kept the portrait in his study for months, and more than once he had found himself studying it longer than he intended.
"The ball is in 3 weeks," Lady Constance said one afternoon, entering his study without knocking, as she often did. "I have arranged the guest list myself this year."
"You always say that," Aldrich said, not looking up from the papers on his desk. "This year it happens to be true," she said. "There will be a great many people you have no interest in meeting, but there will also be one person I believe you should not overlook." Aldrich finally looked up. "Is this about the portrait again?" "It has always been about the portrait," Lady Constance said simply. "I only waited until the timing was right." He did not ask her to explain further. He had learned over the years that his aunt revealed things only when she believed the moment had come, and no amount of pressing would move her faster. Instead, he turned back to the portrait once the door had closed behind her, studying the woman's face again, wondering, not for the first time, who she truly was. His mother had died when he was young, and it had been Lady Constance who raised him through much of his childhood, filling the space left behind with a steadiness he had come to rely on more than he ever admitted aloud. He trusted her judgment more than he trusted his own in matters of the heart, though he would never have said so plainly. If she believed the woman in the portrait mattered, then some part of him, however reluctant, believed it too. He turned the small painting over in his hands one final time before setting it back on the desk, facing outward, where the candlelight caught the edge of her painted smile each time he passed. That night he found himself standing at his window long after the household had gone quiet, looking out at the scattered lights of the city, wondering which one of them might belong to her. The 3 weeks passed quickly for Eleanor, filled with the ordinary business of the shop, fittings and alterations and the constant hum of her mother's sewing machine. She finished her dress with 2 days to spare, and when she tried it on for the final time, standing before the small mirror in the back room, she felt something she had not expected. Not vanity exactly, but a quiet confidence in having made something entirely her own. "You look like yourself," Margaret said, standing in the doorway. "That is a rare thing to see at a royal ball." On the morning of the ball, Eleanor woke early, though the event would not begin until evening. She spent the day finishing small tasks at the shop, unable to focus fully on any of them. Customers came and went, and she smiled and nodded at their conversations without truly hearing them. Her mind kept drifting to the palace, to the tall doors she had only ever seen from the street, to the strange feeling that something was about to change, though she could not have said what. By the time the sun began to set, Eleanor stood in front of the mirror one last time, smoothing the plain blue fabric of her dress. She wore no jewels, no elaborate hairstyle, nothing borrowed or bought for the occasion. She was, in every sense, exactly who she had always been. "Are you frightened?" Oliver asked, watching her from the doorway. "A little," Eleanor admitted, "but I would rather feel frightened tonight than feel regret tomorrow for not going at all." She stepped out into the cool evening air, the invitation folded carefully in her hand, and began the long walk toward the palace gates, unaware that inside those walls, a man she had never met had already chosen to notice her, long before either of them understood what that choice would come to mean. As she approached the palace, the crowd grew thicker, carriages lining the street, women in gowns of silk and satin stepping down onto the stone path with practiced grace. Eleanor walked among them on foot, her simple dress a quiet contrast to the glittering fabric around her. A few heads turned as she passed, some curious, some faintly amused, but she kept her chin level and her steps steady, refusing to let their glances slow her. At the gates, a guard checked her invitation twice, as if expecting to find a mistake in the name written there. When he found none, he stepped aside and allowed her through, and Eleanor walked forward into the palace grounds for the first time in her life, the great doors rising ahead of her, lit from within by hundreds of candles, waiting to reveal whatever the night still had in store. The great hall of the palace was brighter than anything Eleanor had ever seen, hundreds of candles burning in high chandeliers, their light catching on silk gowns and jeweled necklaces until the entire room seemed to shimmer. Eleanor stopped just inside the doorway, overwhelmed by the noise, the music, the sheer number of people moving through the space with a confidence she did not feel. For a moment, she considered turning back. She did not turn back. She walked further into the room, keeping close to the edges where the crowd was thinner, hoping to find a quiet corner where she could watch the evening unfold without being noticed. Her plain blue dress stood out sharply against the silks and satins around her, and she felt eyes turn toward her more than once, some curious, some clearly judging. She held her chin level and kept walking. A group of women near one of the tall windows glanced at her, and exchanged a look Eleanor understood without needing to hear their words. She had seen that look before, in the shop, from customers who assumed her plain clothes meant she had nothing worth saying. She was used to it. She told herself it did not matter, and mostly, she believed it. She found a spot near a marble column where she could watch the dancing without standing directly in anyone's path. Musicians played from a raised platform at the far end of the hall, and couples moved across the floor in patterns Eleanor did not fully understand, elegant and practiced, as though they had been born knowing the steps. She had been standing there only a few minutes when she noticed a shift in the room, a subtle change in the volume of conversation, heads turning toward the entrance. She turned as well, curious, and saw a tall man in a dark formal coat step into the hall, flanked by two attendants who peeled away almost immediately once he had entered. He moved through the crowd with an ease that suggested he had done this 1,000 times before, nodding to guests, exchanging brief words, never lingering long enough for conversation to take hold. Eleanor did not need anyone to tell her who he was. The way the room responded to him, the way people straightened and smiled and leaned slightly forward as he passed, made it obvious. This was Duke Aldrich Rothmore. She looked away quickly, unwilling to be caught staring, and focused her attention back on the dancers. She had no interest in drawing the attention of a duke. She had come to see the palace, not to be seen by it. But when she glanced up again a few minutes later, she found, to her surprise, that his gaze had settled directly on her. Eleanor felt her face grow warm and looked away immediately, certain she had imagined it, or that his attention had simply passed over her on its way to someone else. She busied herself with smoothing the fabric of her dress, though there was nothing to smooth, simply to have something to do with her hands. When she looked up a second time, he was still looking at her, and now he was walking toward her. Her first instinct was panic. She glanced quickly to either side, wondering if perhaps he was walking toward someone standing near her, someone in silk and jewels who actually belonged in this room. But there was no one else close enough for his path to make sense, and within moments, he stood directly before her, closer than she had expected, tall enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he said. His voice was calm, without the practiced smoothness she had expected from a man of his rank. Duke Aldrich Rothmore. "Eleanor Whitmore," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Miss Whitmore." He said her name slowly, as though testing the shape of it. "Would you do me the honor of a dance?" For a moment, Eleanor was certain she had misheard him. She glanced around, half expecting someone to step forward and explain that this was a mistake, that he had confused her for someone else, someone of proper standing who was meant to be standing beside her. No one stepped forward. The nearby guests had gone quiet, watching the exchange with open curiosity. "Your Grace," Eleanor said carefully, "I think perhaps you mean to ask someone else. I am not." "I know exactly who I am asking," he said, cutting her off gently, not unkindly. "Will you dance with me, Miss Whitmore?" She could refuse. She understood, even as the thought crossed her mind, that refusing a duke in the middle of a royal ball would draw far more attention than accepting ever could. But it was not fear of consequence that made her nod. It was something else, some flicker of curiosity she could not fully explain, a sense that this moment, strange as it was, deserved to be met rather than avoided. "Yes," she said, "I will dance with you." He offered his arm, and she took it, aware of every eye in the room following them as they made their way toward the dance floor. The music shifted into a slower melody as they took their positions, and Eleanor, who had learned only the basic steps from watching others in the shop, found herself grateful that Aldrich moved with enough patience to guide her through the unfamiliar rhythm, without making her feel foolish. "You dance as though you would rather be anywhere else," he said, a faint smile touching his mouth. "I have never danced at a ball before," Eleanor admitted. "I have only watched from the edges of rooms like this one, never inside them." "Then I am glad to be the first," he said, and something in the way he said it made Eleanor look up at him more closely, searching his expression for the joke she assumed must be hidden there. She found none. "Your Grace, forgive me, but I don't understand why you chose to dance with me," she said. "There are 100 women in this room better suited to stand beside you." "Perhaps," he said, "but I did not ask any of them." "Why me then?" He was quiet for a moment, his eyes steady on hers as they moved through the slow turns of the dance. "That is a longer answer than I can give you on a crowded floor," he said finally. "Perhaps another time." Eleanor wanted to press further, but something in his tone told her this was not the moment to push, and she let the question go, focusing instead on the movement of the dance, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the strange unreality of the entire evening. Around them, the whispers had already begun. Eleanor could hear fragments of conversation carried on the edges of the music, voices low but not quiet enough. "Who is she? I've never seen her before. That dress. Surely he made a mistake." Eleanor kept her eyes forward, refusing to let the words reach the surface of her expression, though each one landed somewhere beneath it. Aldrich seemed unaffected by the murmurs, or perhaps simply practiced at ignoring them. "You should know," he said quietly, "that this room will talk about tonight for weeks, regardless of what either of us does next." "That is not a comforting thought," Eleanor said. "No," he agreed. "But it is an honest one. I find honesty tends to serve better than comfort in the long run." The dance ended, and for a moment neither of them moved to step apart, the music fading around them while the rest of the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Aldrich bowed slightly, formally, breaking whatever strange stillness had settled between them. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Thank you, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, and stepped back, aware that her heart was beating faster than the music alone could explain. She retreated toward the edge of the room, seeking the quiet corner she had abandoned earlier, but found it harder now to disappear into the background. Several guests glanced her way as she passed, some offering polite nods, others simply staring, unwilling to hide their curiosity. She overheard a woman nearby remark to her companion that the girl in the plain blue dress must have some hidden connection to secure such attention, some family secret worth uncovering. Eleanor pretended not to hear, though the words settled uncomfortably in her chest. She found a spot near the tall windows, away from the densest part of the crowd, and allowed herself a moment to breathe. The night air drifted faintly through a gap in the glass, cool against her warm skin, and she closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady the rush of thoughts moving through her mind. When she opened them again, Lady Constance was standing beside her, an older woman with sharp, observant eyes and a calm, unreadable expression. "You handled that rather well," Lady Constance said without introduction. Eleanor turned, startled. "I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met." "Not yet," the older woman said, a faint smile touching her lips. "But I suspect we will become well acquainted before long. I am Lady Constance, the Duke's aunt." Eleanor's stomach tightened slightly at the words, uncertain what to make of this new attention. "It is a pleasure, my lady." "Is it?" Lady Constance asked, studying her with open curiosity. "Most young women in this room would not call an unexpected conversation with me a pleasure. I have a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions." "I have little to hide," Eleanor said. "I am simply a seamstress's daughter who was invited here by accident, or by kindness. I am still not entirely certain which." "It was neither," Lady Constance said, "but that is a conversation for another evening." She glanced briefly across the room, to where Aldrich stood speaking with a group of nobles, his attention clearly divided, his eyes drifting back toward Eleanor more than once. "For tonight, I will only say this. Whatever happens after tonight, do not let the whispers decide who you believe yourself to be. That mistake is far easier to make than most people realize." Before Eleanor could respond, Lady Constance had already turned and moved back into the crowd, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and a growing, uneasy sense that the evening had set something in motion far larger than a single dance. Not far from where she stood, a young noblewoman named Beatrice Ashworth watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. Beatrice had spent the better part of the season positioning herself carefully near the Duke, attending every gathering he was known to visit, laughing at the correct moments, dressing exactly as fashion demanded. She had believed, with quiet confidence, that her efforts would eventually be rewarded with his attention. Watching him dance instead with a stranger in a plain blue dress felt like a personal insult, one she was not inclined to forgive quickly. "Do you know her?" Beatrice asked one of her companions, her voice low but sharp. "No one seems to," the companion replied. "Some say she is a relation of Lady Harriet's, brought in as a favor." "A favor?" Beatrice repeated, as though tasting something bitter. How generous of Lady Harriet, to hand the Duke's attention to a girl who cannot afford proper silk. Her companion said nothing, sensing the danger in agreeing too readily, but Beatrice's eyes remained fixed on Eleanor for the rest of the evening, tracking her movements with the patient attention of someone already planning her next move. The ball continued around her, music and laughter and the clinking of glasses filling the hall long into the night. But Eleanor remained near the windows for much of it, watching from a distance, aware that she was no longer simply a guest at the edge of the room. She was, whether she wished it or not, now a subject of conversation across the entire hall, and she did not yet know whether that would prove to be a gift or a burden. As the evening wore on and guests began to take their leave, Eleanor found herself near the entrance once more, gathering her shawl, preparing for the long walk home. She glanced back one final time toward the crowded hall and found Aldrich watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable in the candlelight, before a group of guests stepped between them and the moment passed. She walked home beneath a clear sky, the city quiet around her, her mind replaying the evening in fragments she could not quite arrange into order. She did not yet know that the whispers following her out of the palace would follow her far beyond its walls, or that the man who had chosen her for a single dance had, in truth, chosen her long before that night began. When she reached home, Margaret was still awake, sitting by the low fire with a half-finished mending in her lap, waiting for the sound of the door. She rose the moment Eleanor stepped inside, studying her daughter's face with the sharp attentiveness of a mother who had spent years reading small changes in expression. "Well," Margaret said, "tell me everything." Eleanor sat down slowly, still wrapped in her shawl, and found that she did not know where to begin. "I danced with the Duke," she said finally. Margaret's mending slipped from her lap, forgotten. "The Duke himself?" "Duke Aldrich Rothmore," Eleanor said. "He asked me by name. He knew who I was before I told him." "That is not possible," Margaret said slowly, "unless someone told him." "His aunt spoke to me afterward," Eleanor said. "Lady Constance. She said very little, only that I should not let whispers decide who I believe myself to be. I do not know what she meant by it." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring into the low fire, turning the strange evening over in her mind. "Whatever this is," she said finally, "it is larger than one dance. Be careful, Eleanor. Kindness from powerful people does not always come without a price." Eleanor nodded, though she did not fully understand her mother's caution, not yet. She rose and went to her room, but sleep did not come easily. She lay awake long into the night, replaying the Duke's steady gaze, his unfinished answer, the strange certainty in his voice when he had said he knew exactly who he was asking, unaware that far across the city, in a quiet study lit by a single candle, Aldrich was doing much the same, turning the evening over in his mind, wondering how soon he could see her again. By the time the sun rose over the city, word of the ball had already spread far beyond the palace walls. Eleanor woke to the sound of her mother's voice, low and tense, speaking to someone at the front of the shop. She dressed quickly and came downstairs to find two of their regular customers standing near the counter, their conversation stopping abruptly the moment they noticed her. "Eleanor," one of the women said, an older seamstress's client named Mrs. Coalfield, her tone carrying an edge of forced pleasantness. "We heard the most curious thing this morning, something about a dance with the Duke himself." "It was one dance," Eleanor said carefully, "nothing more." "Of course," Mrs. Coalfield said, though her expression suggested she did not quite believe it. "Still, one wonders how such things happen. A seamstress's daughter, dancing with a duke. It does make people talk." After the women left, Margaret closed the shop door behind them, with more force than necessary. "This is what I feared," she said. "One dance, and already the whole city has an opinion." The whispers only grew louder as the day continued. Customers who rarely visited more than once a month suddenly found reasons to stop by, each one offering some version of the same question, wrapped in different words. Had Eleanor truly danced with the Duke? Had she known him before the ball? Was there some secret arrangement between their families that no one had mentioned? Eleanor answered each question the same way, honestly and briefly, but the answers did little to slow the spread of rumor. By evening, a broadsheet seller near the market square was calling out headlines about a mysterious seamstress who had captured the Duke's attention at the royal ball, some claiming she had used charms or trickery to secure his notice, others insisting she must be a hidden noblewoman in disguise. None of it was true. All of it spread regardless. "This is not what I wanted," Eleanor said, sitting at the kitchen table that night, staring at a crumpled broadsheet Oliver had brought home from the market. "I only wanted to see the palace once." "I know," Margaret said gently. "But wanting something small does not always mean you receive something small in return." Oliver, sitting across from them, frowned at the broadsheet. "It says here that you enchanted him with a hidden ring, passed down through secret nobility," he said, unable to hide his amusement despite the tension in the room. "Do we have a secret ring, Eleanor?" "We have a sewing needle and very little else," Eleanor said, though a small reluctant smile crossed her face despite herself. The following morning, a formal letter arrived at the shop. this one bearing the seal of the Rothmore family. Margaret opened it with trembling hands, certain it would bring some official complaint or demand. Instead, it was a brief note from Aldrich himself, requesting permission to call upon Eleanor that afternoon to speak with her directly. "He wants to see you," Margaret said, reading the letter twice before handing it to Eleanor. Eleanor read it herself, her stomach tightening. Part of her wanted to agree immediately, curious to understand what he had meant at the ball, what answer he had promised but never given. But another part of her, wearier now after a full day of whispers and judgment, hesitated. "If he comes here, people will see," Eleanor said. "The whispers will only grow louder." "They will grow louder regardless," Margaret said. "At least this way, you might understand what you are dealing with." Eleanor sent a brief reply agreeing to the visit, though her hands shook slightly as she sealed it. That afternoon, true to his word, a modest carriage arrived outside the shop, drawing curious glances from neighbors who gathered discreetly near their windows to watch. Aldrich stepped down alone, without the attendants who usually accompanied him, dressed more simply than he had been at the ball, as though attempting, in some small way, to lessen the distance between them. Margaret greeted him at the door with careful formality, offering tea, which he accepted with genuine gratitude rather than the practiced politeness Eleanor had expected. He sat across from her at the small kitchen table, looking somewhat out of place among the modest furnishings, though he did not seem uncomfortable. "I owe you an explanation," he said, once Margaret had stepped away to give them privacy, though she remained within easy hearing distance, unwilling to leave her daughter entirely alone with a man of his standing. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "You danced with me once. That is all." "It was not all," he said, "and I think you already suspect that." Eleanor said nothing, waiting. "Months ago," Aldrich continued, "my aunt commissioned a portrait of a young woman she had seen at a market fair. She never told me the woman's name. She only told me to remember the face, and that the right moment would come." He paused, watching Eleanor's expression carefully. "When I saw you across the ballroom, I recognized you immediately. I did not choose you that night by accident, Miss Whitmore. I had already chosen you in some sense, long before we met." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest, though she could not immediately name the feeling. "You had a portrait of me," she repeated slowly. "Without my knowledge." "Without your knowledge?" "Yes," he admitted. "I understand how that must sound to you." "It sounds," Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully, "as though I was chosen the way one chooses a piece of furniture, without ever being consulted." "That was never my intention," Aldrich said, a note of genuine concern entering his voice. "I did not ask my aunt for the portrait. I did not orchestrate any of this. I only knew, the moment I saw you at the ball, that I did not want to let the evening pass without speaking to you." Eleanor studied him carefully, searching his expression for the practiced smoothness she associated with men of his position, the kind of charm that came easily to those accustomed to getting what they wanted. She found instead something that looked closer to nervousness, an unfamiliar rawness in his voice that suggested he had rehearsed this explanation and still found it inadequate. "I need time," Eleanor said finally. "This is not a small thing you are asking me to accept." "I am not asking you to accept anything," Aldrich said. "I only wanted you to hear the truth from me, rather than from rumors that grow more distorted with every retelling." He rose to leave shortly after, and Eleanor walked him to the door, aware of the neighbors still watching discreetly from their windows. Before stepping into his carriage, he turned back to her once more. "Whatever you decide, Miss Whitmore, I will not pursue you against your wishes," he said, "but I would ask that you not let the whispers of this city decide the truth of what happened between us, before you have had the chance to decide it for yourself." Eleanor watched the carriage pull away, her thoughts a tangled mess of confusion, curiosity, and something she did not yet wish to name. She returned inside to find Margaret waiting, her expression a careful mixture of concern and cautious hope. "What will you do?" Margaret asked. "I don't know yet," Eleanor admitted. "I don't know if I can trust something that began without my knowledge, no matter how kindly it was meant." Over the following days, the whispers in the city did not fade. If anything, they grew sharper, fed by the sight of the Duke's carriage outside the modest shop, a detail that had not gone unnoticed by curious neighbors. Rumors shifted from suspicion of trickery to speculation about scandal, some suggesting Eleanor had orchestrated the entire affair for personal gain, others insisting the Duke had been manipulated by ambitious relatives eager to secure a connection to the crown. Eleanor found herself avoiding the market square entirely, sending Oliver instead to handle errands that once would have been simple. She noticed customers at the shop growing more sparse, some longtime patrons choosing to take their business elsewhere rather than be associated with the growing scandal. whatever shape it eventually took. "This is exactly what I feared," Margaret said one evening, reviewing the shop's ledger with a troubled expression. "The whispers may cost us more than pride, Eleanor. They may cost us our livelihood." Oliver returned from the market one afternoon with his jaw set tight and his hands stuffed deep into his pockets, refusing to meet Eleanor's eyes when she asked how the errands had gone. "Oliver," Eleanor said, setting down her sewing. "What happened?" "Nothing," he muttered, though the color in his face said otherwise. "Oliver." He sighed and finally looked up. Some boys near the fruit stall were repeating things they'd heard from their mothers. "About you. About how you must have used some trick to catch the Duke's eye, because no honest woman gets that kind of attention without one." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "I told them to stop, and they laughed at me instead." Eleanor felt her chest tighten, less at the insult itself and more at the sight of her younger brother carrying a burden that was never his to bear. "You should have walked away," she said quietly, though she understood exactly why he hadn't. "Why should I walk away when they're wrong?" Oliver demanded. "You didn't trick anyone. You danced once and answered his questions honestly. That's all anyone has said happened, even the ones spreading the worst of it." "The truth rarely slows a rumor once it has started moving," Eleanor said, echoing something her father used to say, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Unknown to either of them, much of the sharper gossip circling the market square could be traced back to Beatrice Ashworth, who had spent the days since the ball quietly feeding details to anyone willing to listen, careful never to be seen as the source herself. She mentioned Eleanor's name to acquaintances over tea, framed as concern rather than malice, wondering aloud whether the palace had properly looked into the girl's background before allowing her near the Duke at all. The seeds she planted grew quickly in soil already eager for scandal, and within days the story had taken on shapes far beyond anything Beatrice herself had actually said. Guilt settled heavily on Eleanor's shoulders at her mother's words, though she reminded herself, as firmly as she could, that she had done nothing wrong. She had accepted a dance. She had not asked for a portrait to be painted in secret, nor for a duke to build expectations around a face he had seen only once at a market fair. And yet the consequences fell on her regardless, as they so often did for women in her position, whether or not the fault was truly hers to bear. A second letter arrived from Aldrich 2 days after his visit, requesting to see her again, this time to walk together in the palace gardens where they might speak more freely, away from curious neighbors and market gossip. Eleanor read the letter standing at the counter, her fingers tracing the formal handwriting, and found herself shaking her head before she had fully decided to refuse. "I won't go," she told Margaret that evening, setting the letter aside. "Every visit only feeds the rumors further. The shop has already lost customers this week. I won't risk losing more for the sake of a walk in a garden." "That is your choice to make," Margaret said carefully. "But be certain it is truly your reason, Eleanor, and not simply fear wearing the shape of caution." Eleanor sent a polite refusal the following morning, citing the demands of the shop, and told herself firmly that the matter was settled. But the refusal sat uneasily with her over the following days, returning to her thoughts at odd hours, during quiet stretches of sewing, in the moments before sleep. She told herself she had made the sensible choice, the choice that protected her family's livelihood and her own dignity, and yet some small, persistent part of her kept circling back to the unfinished conversation in the palace ballroom, to the question she had never truly heard answered. "Why me, then?" That is a longer answer than I can give you on a crowded floor. Lady Constance visited the shop unannounced a few days later, arriving without the fanfare that had accompanied Aldrich's visit, dressed plainly enough that few passers-by recognized her. She found Eleanor alone in the shop, sorting through a stack of mending, and settled into a chair near the counter without waiting for an invitation. "You look tired," Lady Constance observed. "I am tired," Eleanor admitted. "Tired of being spoken about as though I have no voice of my own in the matter." "That is a fair complaint," Lady Constance said. "I did not consider, when I arranged for that portrait to be painted, how heavily this attention might fall upon you rather than my nephew. That was a failure of judgment on my part, and I offer you my apology for it." Eleanor looked up, surprised by the directness of the admission. "Why did you choose me at all? You did not know me. You had never spoken to me before that fair." "I saw something in your face that day," Lady Constance said. "A kind of steadiness that is rare to find, especially among young women who have been taught their whole lives to shrink themselves smaller to please others. I believed my nephew needed exactly that kind of steadiness in his life, far more than he needed another woman trained to agree with everything he said. That is a great deal of certainty to place in a single glance at a market fair," Eleanor said. "Perhaps," Lady Constance admitted, "but I have rarely been wrong about people, Miss Whitmore. Whether I was wrong this time is entirely up to you to decide." She rose to leave shortly after, pausing once more at the door. "For what it's worth," she said, "my nephew has not smiled as easily as he has these past few days in a very long time. Whatever you decide, know that his interest in you was never a performance for anyone else's benefit." After she left, Eleanor sat alone in the quiet shop for a long while, turning the older woman's words over in her mind, uncertain whether they offered comfort or simply added another weight to the growing pile of expectations pressing in on her from every direction. She did not yet know how to answer the question at the center of it all, whether a connection built on a secret portrait and a single dance could ever grow into something real, or whether it would remain, always, something chosen for her rather than with her. She thought of Oliver's clenched fists at the market, of her mother's tired eyes over the ledger, of the neighbors who no longer greeted her with the same warmth they once had. Part of her wanted to blame Aldrich for all of it, to decide that none of this would have touched her family had he simply chosen someone else to notice that night. But she knew, honestly, that the fault did not belong to him alone. It belonged to a world quick to judge a woman for receiving attention she had never sought, and slow to extend her the same grace it offered so easily to men. That night, as she lay awake listening to the quiet sounds of the city beyond her window, Eleanor made a decision she had not expected to make so soon. She would see Aldrich again, not because the rumors demanded it, and not because his aunt believed in some steadiness she had glimpsed at a fair, but because some quiet, stubborn part of herself wanted to understand, fully and honestly, what exactly stood between them before she allowed either hope or doubt to decide it for her. She rose the next morning and wrote a short letter of her own, before she could talk herself out of it, asking whether his offer to walk in the gardens still stood. She sealed it without rereading her own words, afraid that if she paused too long, caution would win out over curiosity once again, and she was no longer certain that caution was the voice she most wanted to obey. Aldrich's reply arrived the same afternoon, faster than Eleanor expected, as though he had been waiting for her letter before it had even been written. He proposed she visit the palace gardens that following morning, at an hour early enough to avoid the usual crowd of courtiers and visitors who filled the grounds later in the day. Eleanor agreed, and spent the evening before torn between anticipation and a nervousness she could not fully explain, even to herself. The gardens, when she arrived, were quieter than she expected, the early morning air still cool, dew clinging to the trimmed hedges and blooming rose beds that lined the stone paths. Aldrich was already waiting near the entrance, dressed simply, without the formal coat he had worn at their previous meeting, and something about the plainness of his appearance eased a fraction of Eleanor's nervousness. "Thank you for coming," he said, falling into step beside her as they began walking along the path. "I wasn't certain you would." "Neither was I, until this morning," Eleanor admitted. They walked in silence for a while, past rows of flowers Eleanor had never seen up close, their colors more vivid than anything grown in the small plots behind the shops in her neighborhood. She found herself relaxing slightly, the openness of the gardens a welcome change from the crowded, watchful atmosphere of the ball or the tense formality of his visit to her home. "I owe you a fuller answer," Aldrich said eventually, breaking the quiet. "You asked me why I chose you, and I gave you an incomplete response that night." "I remember," Eleanor said. He paused near a low stone bench, gesturing for her to sit, though he remained standing himself, hands clasped loosely behind his back. "My aunt raised me for much of my childhood, after my mother passed," he said. "She has always had a sharp eye for people. Sharper than my own, I think. When she showed me your portrait, I did not understand why she believed it mattered. I told her, more than once, that a painting could not tell a man whether he ought to care for a stranger. And yet you kept it," Eleanor said. "I kept it," he admitted. "I told myself it was simple curiosity. But the truth is, I found myself thinking of the woman in that portrait more often than I expected to think of anyone I had never actually met. There was something in your expression, caught mid-laugh at something outside the frame, that felt entirely unguarded. I had grown so accustomed to women who measured every word and expression around me, calculating what response might please me most. Your portrait held none of that calculation. It felt honest, in a way I had nearly forgotten people could be." Eleanor absorbed this slowly, uncertain how to respond. "That is a great deal to place on a single painted expression," she said finally. "It is," he agreed. "Which is why, when I saw you across the ballroom that night, laughing at something one of the guests near you had said, with that same unguarded expression from the portrait, I knew I could not let the evening pass without speaking to you. It was not the portrait alone that drew me to you, Miss Whitmore. It was recognizing, in person, that the honesty I had seen painted was entirely real." Eleanor sat quietly for a long moment, turning his words over in her mind. Part of her wanted to soften toward him fully, moved by the sincerity in his voice, the careful way he had chosen his explanation rather than offering something easier or more flattering. But another part of her remained cautious, aware of how quickly admiration could curdle into disappointment once the early warmth of attention faded. "I need you to understand something," Eleanor said. "I am not the portrait. I am not some idea you have carried in your mind for months. I have debts to consider, a family to protect, a shop that depends on customers who are already growing uneasy at the mere sight of your carriage outside our door. Whatever this is, it cannot simply exist in gardens and quiet mornings. It has consequences I live with long after you return to this palace." "I understand that," Aldrich said, and something in his tone suggested he had considered this already, more than once. "I do not ask you to forget those consequences. I only ask that you allow me the chance to understand them alongside you, rather than remaining a distant cause of them." "That is easily said," Eleanor replied. "Less easily done from where I stand." He nodded slowly, accepting the weight of her words without argument. "Then let me ask you plainly, Miss Whitmore, not as a duke, and not as the owner of a portrait you never agreed to have painted. What do you want, in this moment, setting aside everything the city has already decided about us?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "I want to understand whether the man who danced with me at that ball, and who walks beside me now in this garden, is speaking to me honestly, or whether he is simply continuing a story his aunt began months ago without my knowledge or consent." "Then ask me anything," Aldrich said. "I will answer as honestly as I know how." They spent the better part of the morning walking through the gardens, Eleanor asking questions she had not expected to voice aloud, about his childhood, his responsibilities, his doubts about his own position. Questions that revealed, slowly, a man far less certain of himself than his public bearing suggested. He spoke of the weight of managing an estate that had been his family's responsibility for generations, of council meetings filled with men more concerned with their own influence than with those the decisions actually affected, of a loneliness he had rarely admitted aloud, surrounded constantly by people yet genuinely known by almost none of them. "You are the first person in a long while who has asked me questions simply to understand me," he admitted at one point, "rather than to determine how I might be useful to them." Eleanor found herself softening further at this admission, recognizing in it an echo of her own experience, the way people so often reduced her to her usefulness, her ability to sew a hem quickly or mend a coat cheaply, rarely curious about anything beyond what she could provide them. "I understand that feeling more than you might expect," she said quietly. By the time they reached the end of the garden path, the sun had risen fully, and the early morning quiet had begun to give way to the sounds of the palace waking around them, servants moving between buildings, distant voices carrying across the grounds. Eleanor knew she needed to return home soon, before her absence drew further attention, but she found herself reluctant to end the conversation. "I still don't know what to make of all this," she admitted, as they walked back toward the entrance. "But I no longer believe you were simply continuing your aunt's story without thought of your own." "That is more than I hoped for when I wrote to you yesterday," Aldrich said. Before they parted, he asked whether she would allow him to call on her again, not immediately, understanding the strain his visits placed on her family's shop, but at some point once the current wave of gossip had begun to settle. Eleanor agreed, cautiously, aware that she was stepping further into a situation she still did not fully understand, but no longer willing to retreat from it entirely. On her way out of the palace grounds, Eleanor encountered Lady Constance near the outer gate, as though the older woman had been waiting for her, though Eleanor suspected this was less coincidence than careful timing. "You look less troubled than when I last saw you," Lady Constance observed, falling into step beside her. "I have fewer questions than I did," Eleanor said, "though not none." "Ask them," Lady Constance said. "I find half-answered questions tend to fester far longer than they should." Eleanor considered for a moment, then asked the question that had lingered beneath all the others since the night of the ball. "Why did you commission the portrait at all? You did not know me. You had no reason to believe I would matter to your nephew, or to anyone." Lady Constance was quiet for a few steps, choosing her words with visible care. "I had watched Aldrich grow more distant each year, surrounded by women who wanted the title beside his name far more than they wanted the man beneath it. I worried honestly that he would eventually choose one of them simply to end the pressure, and spend the rest of his life quietly unhappy in a marriage built on convenience rather than understanding." She paused, near a low wall overlooking the gardens they had just left. "That day at the market fair, I saw you laughing with a child who had dropped a basket of apples, helping her gather them without a second thought, without any awareness that anyone of importance was watching. It was such a small moment, but it stayed with me, long after I had moved on to other business that day. So you commissioned a portrait based on a single moment you happened to witness, Eleanor said, still trying to fully understand the older woman's reasoning. I commissioned a portrait because I trust small moments more than grand performances, Lady Constance said. Anyone can behave kindly when they know they are being watched. Few behave kindly when they believe no one of consequence is paying attention at all. That, to me, said more about your character than any introduction at a formal gathering ever could have. Eleanor absorbed this in silence, unable to fully argue against the logic, even as some part of her still bristled at having been observed and judged without her knowledge. It remains strange to me, she said finally, to learn that a decision shaping my life was made by two people I had never met, based on a single glance at a market fair. That is a fair grievance, Lady Constance said, without defensiveness. I will not pretend otherwise, but I would ask you to judge us, in the end, not by how this began, but by whether what follows proves worthy of the disruption it has caused you. If it does not, you owe neither of us any loyalty simply because of how the story started. Walking home through the quieting streets, Eleanor found herself reflecting on Lady Constance's earlier words, about not letting whispers decide who she believed herself to be. She understood now, more fully than she had at the ball, that the choice before her was not simply whether to trust Aldrich, but whether to trust her own judgment against the noise of a city already eager to write her story, before she had finished living it herself. When she reached the shop, Margaret was waiting, studying her daughter's face with the same careful attentiveness she always brought to matters that mattered most. Well, Margaret said, what did you learn? That the truth is more complicated than either the rumors or my own fears suggested, Eleanor said, and that I still have a great deal to decide, before I know where any of this truly leads. Margaret nodded slowly, accepting this without pressing further, though the quiet hope in her expression was impossible to fully hide. Later that afternoon, an elderly customer named Mrs. Findlay arrived at the shop with a torn coat sleeve, one of the few longtime patrons who had continued visiting despite the gossip swirling through the neighborhood. She sat patiently while Eleanor worked, watching her with the quiet, unhurried attention of someone who had known the family for years. They're all talking nonsense out there, Mrs. Findlay said eventually, nodding toward the street. I've known you since you were small enough to hide under this very counter during thunderstorms. Whatever is happening with that Duke, I doubt very much it has anything to do with tricks or schemes. You were never that sort of girl. Thank you, Eleanor said, genuinely touched. Not everyone shares your certainty. Not everyone bothered to actually know you before forming an opinion, Mrs. Findlay said simply. That is their failing, not yours to carry. The small kindness settled something in Eleanor that the morning's long conversation in the garden had not quite managed to reach, a reminder that not every eye in the city viewed her with suspicion, even if those voices were currently the quieter ones. She returned to her sewing that afternoon, her hands moving through familiar steady work, while her mind continued turning over the morning's conversation, aware that whatever came next would require a courage entirely different from the courage it had taken simply to walk into a ballroom in a plain blue dress. 3 weeks passed before Aldrich called on Eleanor again, weeks in which the loudest of the city's gossip slowly quieted, replaced by newer scandals that drew the crowd's fickle attention elsewhere. The shop's customers returned gradually, though a few, like Mrs. Colefield, remained noticeably distant, unwilling to fully release their suspicion. Eleanor used the quiet weeks to steady herself, returning to the familiar rhythm of her work, though thoughts of the garden conversation lingered at the edges of her mind more often than she cared to admit. Oliver, too, noticed a change in the neighborhood over those weeks, the boys who had once repeated cruel rumors near the fruit stall growing quieter, as newer, more exciting scandals captured the city's attention instead. A councilman's son had reportedly run off with a traveling performer, and the story proved far more entertaining to repeat than anything involving a seamstress and a single dance. Eleanor found a strange relief in becoming, briefly, yesterday's gossip rather than today's. Margaret watched her daughter carefully during those quiet weeks, noting the way Eleanor's hands would sometimes still over her sewing, her gaze drifting toward the window, as though searching the street for a carriage that never came. She said nothing directly, choosing instead to let her daughter arrive at her own conclusions in her own time, though she found herself hoping, more than she admitted even to herself, that the strange, complicated connection would prove itself worth the trouble it had already caused. The invitation that finally arrived was not for a private visit but for a garden gathering hosted by the Rothmore family, a smaller, more intimate affair than the royal ball, though still populated by a great many nobles Eleanor had never met. Aldrich's letter explained that his family held the gathering each year to mark the early days of summer, and that he wished for her to attend, not as a curiosity to be whispered about, but as someone he intended to introduce properly to those who mattered most in his life. You don't have to go, Margaret said, watching Eleanor read the letter for the third time. You have already given him more chances than most women in your position would. I know, Eleanor said, but I think I want to go. Not for him, entirely. For myself. I want to see whether I can stand in that world without shrinking, or whether the whispers will always win in the end. She wore the same blue dress she had worn to the ball, cleaned and carefully mended where a seam had begun to loosen, unwilling to pretend to be anyone other than who she had been the night they met. When she arrived at the Rothmore estate, the gardens were already filled with guests, smaller in number than the ball but no less intimidating in their easy confidence, their careless familiarity with a world Eleanor still felt like a visitor within. Aldrich greeted her personally near the entrance, his expression brightening in a way he did not seem to notice himself. You came, he said. I said I would, Eleanor replied. He led her through the gathering, introducing her to a handful of relatives and close family friends, most of whom greeted her with polite, if reserved, curiosity. Eleanor answered their questions honestly, aware that many of them had likely heard some version of the rumors already circulating through the city, and unwilling to offer anything less than the plain truth in response. It was near the fountain at the center of the garden that Beatrice Ashworth finally approached, flanked by two companions, her expression arranged into a careful mask of polite interest that did little to hide the sharpness beneath it. Miss Whitmore, Beatrice said, her voice carrying just enough for nearby guests to hear. How lovely to finally meet the woman everyone has been discussing all season. Lady Ashworth, Eleanor replied evenly, having learned her name through the whispers that had followed her for weeks now. It's a pleasure. Is it? Beatrice asked, tilting her head slightly. I imagine it must be strange standing here among us, given your background. Tell me, does your family still run that little shop near the market? Mending coats, I believe someone mentioned. The question was delivered lightly, almost playfully, but Eleanor understood its purpose immediately, felt the small crowd gathering nearby lean subtly closer, curious to see how she would respond. Yes, Eleanor said simply. My mother and I run it together. We've mended a great many coats over the years and taken pride in every one of them. How admirable, Beatrice said, though her tone suggested otherwise. It must be quite an adjustment, moving from mending coats to attending gatherings such as this. I do wonder whether some women are simply better suited to certain rooms than others. A ripple of uncomfortable silence spread among the nearby guests, several exchanging glances, uncertain whether to laugh along with Beatrice's implication or to object to its cruelty. Eleanor felt heat rise in her chest, not from embarrassment, but from something steadier, something closer to resolve. You're right that I wasn't raised in rooms like this one, Eleanor said, her voice calm but clear enough to carry. I was raised in a shop, learning to fix what others had torn, and to make something whole out of very little. I don't think that makes me unsuited to stand here, Lady Ashworth. I think it means I understand the value of things more clearly than someone who has never had to mend anything with her own hands. Beatrice's expression flickered, caught off guard by the steadiness of the response, though she recovered quickly. A charming sentiment, she said. Though sentiment rarely determines where a person truly belongs. Then perhaps you can tell me what does, Eleanor said, holding the other woman's gaze without wavering. Birth, I assume, is your answer. But I would ask you this, Lady Ashworth. If a person's worth is measured only by the family they were born into, what exactly have you accomplished yourself, beyond the good fortune of your own birth, to claim you belong here more than I do? A few nearby guests exchanged startled glances, someone stifling a small, surprised laugh quickly behind a gloved hand. Beatrice's composure cracked visibly for the first time, color rising in her cheeks. I do not need to justify my place in society to a shopkeeper's daughter, Beatrice said, her voice sharper now, the polite mask slipping further. No, Eleanor agreed calmly. You don't. Just as I don't need to justify mine to you. I only wished you to notice that you had been trying to, this entire conversation, without ever once being asked. Aldrich, who had stepped away briefly to greet an arriving guest, returned in time to catch the final exchange, his expression shifting immediately from polite ease to something firmer. He moved to stand beside Eleanor, close enough that the message was unmistakable. Lady Ashworth, he said, his voice carrying a formal edge Eleanor had not heard from him before. I would ask that you extend Miss Whitmore the same courtesy you would extend any guest in my family's home. I meant no offense, Your Grace, Beatrice said quickly, her composure slipping slightly under his direct attention. I was simply curious about her background, given how suddenly she has appeared in our circles. Her background is not a mystery requiring investigation, Aldrich said, and I would remind you that questioning a guest's worth based on her family's trade says a great deal more about the one asking than the one being questioned. The garden had grown noticeably quiet around them, guests pausing their own conversations to watch the exchange unfold, drawn by the rare sight of the Duke speaking so directly, so publicly, in defense of someone the city had spent weeks whispering about. Beatrice, sensing the shift in the crowd's attention, offered a stiff, shallow curtsy and retreated with her companions, though not before casting one final, unreadable glance toward Eleanor. Once she had gone, Aldrich turned to Eleanor, his expression softening slightly, though the firmness remained beneath it. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have stayed closer." "You don't need to apologize," Eleanor said. "I handled it well enough on my own." "You did," he agreed. "Better than well enough. But you shouldn't have needed to, not in my family's own garden." Lady Constance had watched the entire exchange from a short distance away, standing near a trellis of climbing roses with a cup of tea she had not touched in several minutes. When Eleanor caught her eye across the garden, the older woman offered the faintest of nods, something close to approval settling into her expression, before she turned back to the guest beside her as though nothing of particular note had occurred. The quiet murmur of conversation slowly resumed around them, though Eleanor could feel the shift in how the remaining guests regarded her, a subtle change from curious suspicion toward something closer to genuine interest. A few approached over the following hour, asking questions about her work at the shop with what seemed like real curiosity, rather than veiled judgment, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time since the ball, speaking about her life, without feeling the need to defend it. An older gentleman, introduced to her as a cousin of Aldrich's father, asked in genuine fascination how long it took to properly tailor a coat, admitting he had never once considered the labor behind the garments he wore each day. A younger woman, clearly nervous about her own uncertain place among the family's wealthier connections, confided quietly that she had found Eleanor's response to Lady Ashworth the most satisfying thing she had witnessed at a gathering in years. Eleanor answered each conversation with the same plain honesty she had offered Beatrice, and found, to her quiet surprise, that honesty seemed to serve her far better in this world than she had ever expected it might. Later in the afternoon, as the gathering began to wind down, Aldrich led her to a quieter section of the garden, away from the remaining guests, where a low bench sat beneath the shade of an old oak tree. "I want to say something plainly," he said once they had settled, "because I think you deserve plainness more than careful phrasing." Eleanor waited, watching him steady himself before continuing. "When my aunt first showed me that portrait, I resisted the idea entirely," he said. "I told myself a duke's marriage was a matter of alliances and estates, not paintings of strangers at market fairs. But watching you today, standing in that garden and refusing to shrink under Lady Ashworth's questions, I understood something I hadn't fully allowed myself to admit before now. It was never simply the portrait that drew me to you. It is this: the way you meet difficulty without folding beneath it. I don't want a wife who will smile politely and agree with whatever the room expects of her. I want someone who will stand exactly as you stood today, regardless of who is watching." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest at his words, the last remnants of doubt she had been carrying since the night of the ball beginning, finally, to settle into something calmer. "I still don't fully understand how any of this began," she said. "A portrait, a duke's aunt, a single dance that turned my entire life into something the whole city felt entitled to discuss. But I understand you better now than I did a month ago, and I think, for the first time since that ball, I am no longer afraid of what people will say when they see us together." "That is more than I hoped to hear today," Aldrich said, a smile breaking across his face, one Eleanor had not yet seen from him, unguarded in a way his public expressions never quite managed to be. "I should tell you," Eleanor added, "that even if I am no longer afraid, my mother's shop still depends on customers who may never fully warm to the idea of you standing beside me. I cannot promise the whispers will vanish simply because today went well." "I don't expect them to vanish," Aldrich said. "I only hope that in time, they matter less than they do now. And whatever the shop needs, in the meantime, you have only to ask, not as charity, but as someone who understands what it means to protect the people you love." "I would rather earn our way than depend on your name to shield us," Eleanor said, a note of firmness entering her voice. "I would expect nothing less from you," he said, and the warmth in his expression suggested he meant it entirely. "I only offer, Miss Whitmore. I do not insist." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile at that, recognizing, not for the first time, that he seemed to understand her more clearly than she had initially given him credit for. "Then perhaps, in time, I will let you help in small ways," she said. "Once I am certain it is help freely given, and not another quiet arrangement made without my knowledge." "Fair enough," he said, laughing softly, the sound easy and genuine. "I believe I have learned my lesson about arrangements made without your knowledge." They sat together beneath the old oak tree as the garden slowly emptied around them, the afternoon light softening into early evening, and for the first time since the invitation had first arrived at her family's shop, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine, however cautiously, what a life built openly and honestly beside this man might actually look like, no longer shaped entirely by rumors or secret portraits, but by choices they were finally beginning to make together, in full view of anyone willing to watch. When his carriage returned her home that evening, Margaret was waiting at the door, having spent the day imagining every possible outcome the gathering might have produced. She studied Eleanor's face closely as she stepped down from the carriage, searching for signs of distress, and finding, instead, a calm she had not seen in her daughter since long before the royal ball had ever arrived at their door. "Tell me everything," Margaret said, echoing the same words she had spoken weeks earlier, though her tone carried far less anxiety this time. Eleanor recounted the afternoon as they sat together in the small kitchen, the confrontation with Beatrice, Aldrich's firm defense, the quiet conversation beneath the oak tree. Oliver, listening from the doorway, could not fully suppress his grin when Eleanor described her exchange with Lady Ashworth. "You truly asked her what she had accomplished beyond being born into money," he said, half laughing. "I would have paid good coin to see her face." "It was worth seeing," Eleanor admitted, a small smile finally breaking through her own composure. Margaret listened to the entire account with careful attention, and when Eleanor finished, she reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "I still worry," she said honestly. "This world is not one that gives up its judgments easily, no matter how well one afternoon goes, but I have not seen you stand this steadily in weeks, and that alone tells me something worth trusting." "I don't know exactly what comes next," Eleanor admitted, "but for the first time since that ball, I am not dreading it." Margaret squeezed her hand once before releasing it, satisfied, for the moment, with an answer that offered no guarantees but a great deal of quiet hope. The weeks following the garden gathering settled into a rhythm neither Eleanor nor Aldrich had quite expected. He visited the shop openly now, no longer concerned with hiding his interest behind careful timing or quiet letters, and though a few neighbors still whispered when his carriage appeared on their street, the whispers had softened into something closer to curiosity than judgment. Eleanor continued her work, mending coats and stitching hems, and found, to her quiet relief, that the steady rhythm of the shop remained largely unchanged despite everything else shifting around it. Aldrich began arriving in the late afternoons, once the day's customers had thinned, sitting quietly near the window while Eleanor finished her work, occasionally attempting, with limited success, to thread a needle himself under Margaret's amused supervision. "You hold it entirely wrong," Margaret told him one afternoon, watching him fumble with a length of thread for the third time. "I have managed entire estates," Aldrich said, laughing at his own clumsiness. "And yet this small task defeats me completely." "Estates do not require patience the way fabric does," Margaret replied, taking the needle from his hands and threading it herself in a single practiced motion. "Perhaps that is a lesson worth learning." Eleanor watched these small exchanges with a warmth she had not expected to feel so easily. The sight of a duke sitting awkwardly in her family's modest shop, laughing at his own failed attempts at sewing, doing more to settle her remaining doubts than any grand declaration could have managed. She began to understand, slowly, that the version of Aldrich she saw here, relaxed and unguarded, was perhaps closer to his true nature than the composed, formal figure she had first met across a crowded ballroom. Despite the growing ease between them, Eleanor found herself, on quiet nights, still wrestling with doubts she had not fully voiced to anyone, not even Margaret. She worried, in the dark hours before sleep, whether she could truly belong in a world so different from the one she had known her entire life, whether the warmth she felt sitting beside Aldrich in her family's shop would survive the weight of formal dinners, council gatherings, and the constant scrutiny that came with his title. She thought of Beatrice's sharp questions in the garden, and wondered how many more Beatrices waited in the years ahead, each one eager to remind her that she had not been born into this world. She raised these doubts once, quietly, during one of Aldrich's late afternoon visits, watching him fail once again at threading a needle under Margaret's patient instruction. "Does it frighten you?" she asked. "That I will never move through your world as easily as the women who were raised in it?" Aldrich set the needle down and considered the question seriously, without the easy reassurance she half expected from him. "It does not frighten me," he said finally. "It relieves me. I have spent my whole life surrounded by people who moved through my world so easily that I could never tell whether their warmth toward me was genuine or simply well practiced. I would rather stand beside someone who has to work to find her footing, and finds it honestly, than someone who never had to work for anything at all." Eleanor turned this answer over for a long moment, feeling something in her chest loosen further. That is not the answer I expected, she admitted. I have found, Aldrich said, that the truest answers rarely are. One evening, several weeks into this new rhythm, Aldrich arrived at the shop not in the late afternoon as usual, but earlier, dressed more formally than his recent visits, a nervousness in his manner that Eleanor had not seen from him since their very first conversation. You look as though you have somewhere important to be, Eleanor said, setting aside her sewing. I do, he said, though I was hoping you might allow me to speak with your mother first, before I explain further. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, though she said nothing, watching as he turned to Margaret, who had gone still near the counter, sensing, perhaps before Eleanor herself fully did, what this visit truly meant. Mrs. Whitmore, Aldrich said, his formal bearing returning, though his voice carried a rawness beneath it that no amount of noble training could fully smooth away. I have come to ask your blessing. I intend to ask Eleanor to marry me, and I did not wish to do so without first speaking honestly with you, as her family, rather than simply arriving with a title, and assuming that alone should be sufficient. Margaret stared at him for a long moment, clearly moved by the gesture, unaccustomed to a man of his standing extending such consideration to a family so far beneath his own in wealth and position. Most men in your position, she said finally, would not think to ask. Then most men in my position are making a grave mistake, Aldrich said simply. Eleanor has taught me, these past months, that the things worth having are rarely the things simply taken. I would not wish to begin a marriage by skipping the one conversation that matters most to the family who raised her. Margaret glanced toward Eleanor, who stood frozen near her sewing table, unable to fully process the moment unfolding in front of her. You have my blessing, Margaret said finally, her voice thick with emotion she did not try to hide. Though the decision, of course, remains entirely my daughter's to make. I would expect nothing less, Aldrich said, before turning finally to Eleanor herself, crossing the small shop to stand before her, taking her hands gently in his own. Eleanor, he said, and something in the way he said her name, stripped of any formal title, made her breath catch. I did not choose you because of a portrait my aunt commissioned at a market fair, though I will always be grateful she did. I chose you again, every day since that ball, watching you stand steadily against whispers that would have broken someone less certain of themselves. I chose you in the garden, when you refused to shrink beneath Lady Ashworth's questions. I choose you now, not as the woman in a painting I once kept on my desk, but as the woman who taught me what honesty actually looks like, in a world that had nearly convinced me it no longer existed. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, simple ring, far less elaborate than Eleanor might have expected from a man of his position, its design plain and understated, closer in spirit to something she herself might have made than to the ornate jewelry worn by the noblewomen at the ball. I had it made specifically without excess, he said, noticing her expression. I did not want you to feel as though accepting meant becoming someone other than yourself. Whatever you choose, Eleanor, I do not wish for you to disappear into a title. I wish for you to remain exactly who you are, standing beside me, rather than behind me. Eleanor felt tears gathering, unexpected and unbidden, as she looked from the ring to his face, searching, one final time, for any trace of doubt or hesitation in his expression, and finding none. She thought of her father, of his belief that pride meant standing honestly as yourself wherever you happened to be, and understood, with sudden clarity, that this man standing before her, awkward with a sewing needle and plain in his choice of ring, was offering her exactly that, a chance to remain herself within a life far larger than the one she had ever imagined for herself. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. I will marry you. Aldrich's composed formality broke entirely at her answer, a genuine, unguarded joy spreading across his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands not quite steady, despite months of practiced control in far more difficult circumstances. Margaret, watching from across the room, pressed a hand to her mouth, unable to fully contain her own emotion, while Oliver, who had been listening from the stairwell without either of them noticing, let out a whoop of delight that startled them all into laughter. News of the engagement spread through the city quickly, though this time the whispers carried a different tone entirely. Less scandal and more genuine fascination at a story that seemed, to many, almost too fitting to be entirely true. The seamstress's daughter who had worn the simplest dress at the royal ball, chosen not for her connections or her wealth, but for a steadiness of character a duke's aunt had glimpsed in a single unguarded moment at a market fair. Beatrice Ashworth, upon hearing the news, retreated from public gatherings for some weeks, though eventually she reappeared at social functions with her composure fully restored, offering polite congratulations to Eleanor that carried, if not warmth, at least a grudging respect earned through the confrontation in the garden. Eleanor, for her part, held no lasting resentment, understanding that Beatrice's cruelty had grown from her own insecurities rather than any true malice toward a stranger she had never properly known. Even Mrs. Colefield, who had remained distant through much of the earlier gossip, returned to the shop shortly after the engagement was announced, bringing with her a length of fine wool and an unusually warm greeting. "I confess I doubted you," Mrs. Colefield said, setting the fabric on the counter. "I let the whispers convince me of things that were never true. I hope you can forgive an old woman her foolishness." "There is nothing to forgive," Eleanor said, and meant it fully. "The whispers convinced a great many people of things that were never true. I understand better than most how easily that happens." The shop itself flourished in the months that followed, its modest reputation transformed by the widely known story of the seamstress who had captured a duke's genuine devotion, though Eleanor made clear, whenever asked, that she had no intention of abandoning the work that had shaped her long before any of this had begun. She continued mending coats and stitching hems alongside her mother, insisting that whatever grand life awaited her at the Rothmore estate, this shop would always remain hers as well. A place she returned to not out of necessity, but out of genuine belonging. The engagement was formally announced not at another grand ball but at a smaller, more private gathering held in the Rothmore Gardens, attended only by close family and the handful of friends who had proven genuine throughout the preceding months. Eleanor wore, deliberately and without hesitation, the same simple blue dress she had worn to the royal ball months earlier, the same dress she had worn to the garden gathering where she had stood her ground against Beatrice's questions, the dress that had become, in its own quiet way, a symbol of everything she had refused to compromise throughout the entire ordeal. "Are you certain you don't want something grander?" Margaret asked gently, helping her daughter prepare that evening. "You could have any gown in the city made for this occasion, and no one would think twice." "I am certain," Eleanor said, smoothing the familiar fabric one final time. "This dress is where all of this began. It seems fitting that it should be here for this moment too." Lady Constance, arriving early to the gathering, found Eleanor near the garden entrance, and studied the familiar blue dress with open approval. "I recognized that fabric the moment I saw you tonight," she said. "A fitting choice, Miss Whitmore, though I suppose, before long I shall have to grow accustomed to calling you something else entirely." "There will be time enough for that," Eleanor said, smiling. "Tonight, I am simply glad to be exactly who I have always been, standing here among all of you." Mrs. Findlay, the loyal customer who had defended Eleanor months earlier over a torn coat sleeve, had been invited at Eleanor's own insistence, and she approached now, beaming with unguarded pride, clutching Eleanor's hands warmly between her own. "I always said there was nothing scheming about you," Mrs. Findlay said, "though I confess I never imagined it would end quite this grandly." "Neither did I," Eleanor admitted, laughing softly. "I only wanted to see the palace once." "And now you shall see it every day of your life," Mrs. Findlay said, shaking her head in fond disbelief. "Life does have a curious sense of humor." Oliver, dressed uncomfortably in a formal coat borrowed for the occasion, spent much of the evening trailing after Aldrich with a barrage of questions about estate management and horses, questions Aldrich answered with far more patience than Eleanor had expected, clearly enjoying the boy's unfiltered curiosity after so many years surrounded by guarded adult conversation. Margaret watched the two of them together from across the garden, her expression carrying a quiet, contented relief that had been slowly building for weeks, ever since the day Aldrich had asked her blessing rather than simply assuming it. "He is good to your brother," Margaret said, joining Eleanor near the fountain. "That tells me more than any grand declaration could." "I noticed the same thing," Eleanor said, watching Oliver gesture animatedly while Aldrich listened with genuine attention. "I think that is precisely why I trust him." As the evening progressed, Aldrich found her near the same fountain where Beatrice had once tried and failed to diminish her, and took her hand gently, leading her a short distance away from the gathered guests, toward the quiet oak tree where he had first spoken so plainly about his reasons for choosing her. "Do you remember," he said, "standing at the edge of that ballroom, certain I had made some mistake in choosing you?" "I remember," Eleanor said. "I nearly refused the dance entirely." "I am endlessly grateful you did not," he said, drawing her closer. "Though I confess even now I still do not fully understand what my aunt saw in a single glance at that market fair, clearly enough to set all of this into motion." "Perhaps it does not matter how it began," Eleanor said, looking up at him with a certainty she had not felt in the earliest, most uncertain days of their strange courtship. "What matters is what we have chosen to build since, together, in full view of anyone willing to watch." Around them, the garden filled with quiet laughter and warm conversation, the soft glow of lanterns strung between the trees casting gentle light across the gathered guests. And for the first time since that single unexpected letter had arrived bearing the royal seal, Eleanor felt no uncertainty at all about the path that had led her here, standing exactly as herself, in the simplest dress she owned, beside a man who had chosen her, and continued choosing her, long before either of them had understood what that choice would come to mean. The wedding took place on a mild autumn morning, the kind of day Eleanor's father had always favored for long walks. The air crisp but not unkind, the sky clear enough that the palace grounds seemed to glow faintly gold in the early light. Eleanor stood in a small preparation room within the Rothmore estate, watching Margaret adjust the final pins in a wedding dress Eleanor herself had designed and sewn over the preceding weeks, refusing every offer from Aldrich's family to commission something grander from the city's most celebrated tailors. "You are certain," Margaret said, stepping back to study her daughter, "that you would rather wear something you made yourself, on a day like this, than something stitched by the finest hands in the kingdom?" "There are no finer hands than yours and mine," Eleanor said, smiling. "And I would rather walk toward my future in something that carries our work, than in something that carries only someone else's name." The dress was simple in its foundation, much like the blue gown that had started everything. But Eleanor had allowed herself, this once, a few careful additions, delicate embroidery along the sleeves that Margaret had helped stitch during quiet evenings, small white flowers worked into the fabric near the hem, subtle enough not to overwhelm the honest simplicity of the design, but enough to mark the occasion as the significant one it truly was. Oliver, now noticeably taller than he had been at the start of the year, appeared at the doorway dressed in a formal coat that fit him properly this time, no longer borrowed and ill-suited to his frame. "They're ready for you," he said, his voice carrying a seriousness that suited the occasion, though his eyes shone with unmistakable excitement. Eleanor took a final steadying breath before stepping out into the palace gardens, where rows of guests had gathered beneath strings of pale ribbon woven between the trees, the same gardens where she had once walked uncertainly beside Aldrich, where she had once stood her ground against Beatrice's sharp questions, where he had once explained, plainly and honestly, exactly why he had chosen her. Aldrich waited at the end of the garden path, dressed formally but without excessive ornament, his expression carrying the same unguarded warmth she had first glimpsed beneath the old oak tree months earlier. As she walked toward him, past familiar faces and unfamiliar ones alike, Eleanor felt none of the fear that had gripped her the night she first walked through the palace gates. She felt, instead, a quiet certainty that had been building steadily since that very first evening, a certainty that had survived rumors, public confrontations, and every doubt she had allowed herself to voice along the way. Lady Constance sat near the front of the gathered guests, dressed elegantly but without the sharp scrutiny Eleanor had once feared from her, her expression instead carrying something close to quiet pride, as though she had known, from the very moment she commissioned that first portrait at the market fair, that this exact day would eventually arrive. The ceremony itself was brief, formal in its structure but warm in its execution, and when Aldrich finally slipped a plain matching band onto Eleanor's finger beside the simple engagement ring he had chosen months earlier, the assembled guests broke into genuine, unrestrained applause, a sound entirely different from the polite, measured reception Eleanor had once received at her first royal ball. The celebration that followed carried long into the evening, filled with music and laughter and dancing that Eleanor now moved through with far more confidence than she had possessed at their very first dance together. Mrs. Findlay danced with an enthusiasm well beyond her years, insisting loudly to anyone nearby that she had known, from the very beginning, that nothing but good could come from a girl so honest and steady. Beatrice Ashworth attended as well, offering a genuine, if brief, congratulations before retreating to quieter conversation elsewhere in the garden. The old rivalry between them finally settled into something closer to distant civility than open hostility. In the months that followed the wedding, Eleanor settled gradually into her new life, dividing her time carefully between the demands of the Rothmore estate and the shop she refused to abandon. She continued sewing alongside Margaret several days each week, insisting that the calluses on her hands remained as much a part of her identity as any title she now carried. Aldrich, for his part, grew increasingly comfortable within the modest walls of the shop, eventually mastering the basic stitches Margaret had once mocked him for fumbling, though he remained, by his own cheerful admission, far better suited to managing estates than mending coats. Their marriage was not without its difficulties. Certain members of the nobility remained coolly distant, unwilling to fully accept a duchess who had once mended garments for a living, and Eleanor learned, over time, to meet their quiet disapproval with the same steady dignity she had shown Beatrice in the garden months earlier, neither shrinking from their judgment nor allowing it to reshape who she truly was. Aldrich, in turn, grew increasingly protective of his wife's dignity in public settings, though Eleanor rarely needed his intervention, having grown entirely comfortable defending her own place in rooms that had once intimidated her deeply. Lady Constance visited often during that first year, watching the marriage settle into its own steady rhythm with evident satisfaction. I told my nephew, long before any of this began, that he needed a woman who understood the value of things, rather than simply their price, she said to Eleanor one afternoon, watching Aldrich struggle cheerfully with a length of thread in the corner of the shop. I confess, even I did not expect the lesson to take quite this literally. Perhaps some lessons require repetition before they truly settle, Eleanor said, smiling as she watched her husband finally succeed in threading the needle, holding it aloft with the same triumphant pride he might have shown after settling a difficult matter of state. Word of their unlikely courtship continued circulating through the kingdom long after the wedding itself had passed, told and retold until it had taken on the shape of legend among certain circles. The story of a duke who had chosen his wife not for her fortune or her family name, but for a single unguarded moment of kindness witnessed at a market fair, and for the steady honesty she had carried with her ever since. Eleanor found herself, on occasion, meeting young women in similar circumstances to her own, women uncertain of their place among wealth and title, and she made a quiet habit of offering them the same reassurance Lady Constance had once offered her, that whispers need not decide who a person believes herself to be. Oliver, meanwhile, found himself increasingly drawn to the estate's stables, spending long afternoons learning the management of horses and grounds from the estate's senior groundskeeper, a gruff but patient man named Edmund who took an immediate liking to the boy's genuine curiosity. Aldrich, noticing the growing interest, quietly arranged for Oliver to begin a proper apprenticeship the following spring, though he took care to present the opportunity through Edmund rather than offering it directly himself, mindful of Eleanor's earlier insistence that their family earn its own way rather than lean too heavily on borrowed influence. You did not have to arrange that so carefully, Eleanor told him, once she discovered the quiet maneuvering behind Oliver's apprenticeship. I wanted him to feel he had earned it through his own interest, not simply received it through my name, Aldrich said. I remembered what you told me that first day in the garden, about wanting to earn your way rather than depend on charity. It seemed only right to extend your brother the same respect. Margaret, too, found her circumstances gradually easing, though she remained as stubbornly independent as her daughter, refusing any suggestion that she retire from the shop entirely. Instead, she took on a young apprentice of her own from the neighborhood, a quiet girl named Charlotte who reminded Margaret in certain unguarded moments of Eleanor at that same age, careful and precise with her stitching, unwilling to accept praise she did not feel she had fully earned. You have built something rather remarkable here, Aldrich observed one evening, watching Margaret patiently correct Charlotte's uneven seam. Not just a shop, but a place people genuinely wish to belong to. That was never my doing alone, Margaret said, glancing toward Eleanor. My daughter taught me, without ever quite meaning to, that honest work draws honest people toward it, title or no title. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Aldrich surprised her with a simple gift, wrapped without ceremony, containing the original portrait his aunt had commissioned so long ago, the painting that had begun everything between them. He had commissioned a second portrait alongside it, painted more recently, capturing Eleanor not at a market fair among strangers, but seated at her sewing table in the shop she had never abandoned, needle in hand, entirely herself. I wanted them displayed together, he explained, so that whenever either of us doubts how far we have come, we can look at both and remember exactly where it all began, and exactly where we chose to take it ourselves. Eleanor studied the two portraits side by side, the stranger captured mid-laugh at a market fair, and the Duchess who had never once stopped being a seamstress at heart, and felt, for the first time since that very first letter had arrived bearing the royal seal, a complete and settled peace with everything the strange, unlikely journey had cost, and given her in equal measure. They are both me, she said softly. I am glad you understood that, long before I fully understood it myself. I think, Aldrich said, drawing her close, that is precisely why I chose you, and why I would choose you again, in every version of this story, however many times it were told. Outside their window, the city continued its familiar rhythms, market stalls opening at dawn, seamstress shops threading needles by candlelight, ordinary lives unfolding exactly as they always had. But within the walls of the Rothmore estate, and within the small shop near the market square that Eleanor still visited every week without fail, a quiet, honest love continued growing steadily, built not on the accident of a single ball or the secrecy of a hidden portrait, but on every honest choice that had followed since, made freely, and made together, exactly as Eleanor had always insisted it should be.